Shalom, family. It's your brother Benayah Israel, guiding you on the road to Savannah. And for this journey, we will review both the evidence and the facts. First, we begin by reviewing the fact that Europeans during medieval times, which dates all the way back to roughly 500 AD, understood Jews to be black. This fact was restated by Professor Abraham Melamon, a professor in the Department of Jewish History and Thought at the University of Haifa, Israel. He states, and I quote, "A strong European tradition, dating back to the Middle Ages, maintained that Jews were black, or at least swarthy, and finds sharp expression in modern anti-Semitic literature." This fact was also stated by Professor Jacob Shavit, a professor of the history of the Jewish people at Tel Aviv University in Israel. In his book, History in Black African Americans in Search of an Ancient Past, he states, and I quote, "In medieval literature, a theory prevailed in which the Jews were part of the black race, or were at least dark-skinned." You see, fam, Jews being black wasn't some fabrication of a black man in the Americas. This fact was well known throughout Europe, well before the first transatlantic slave ever set foot in America. This fact of Judah being black is confirmed in the Lakesh relief, carved roughly 700 to 681 BC, in which the Assyrians depicted the tribe of Judah as a woolly-headed black man. Additionally, archaeology at Lakesh confirmed and classified the tribe of Judah as an Egypto-Nubian people based on cranial analysis. You see, fam, these Egypto-Nubian black sons of Judah, who made their way to Spain and Portugal and eventually made their way to Savannah, Georgia, listed on historical records as Sephardic Jews, living in and around First African Baptist Church in the 1700s and the 1800s. This fact was captured in history books, which document the presence of Jews in Georgia. Not only were Israelites living in the same neighborhood as First African Baptist Church, these same Israelites met in a synagogue on the same street as First African Baptist Church. And some of these Israelites were wealthy, however, others were listed as servants, workers, and inmates. You see, fam, because there were Israelites in the hood, we aren't surprised to see pastors of First African Baptist Church refer to themselves as Israelites, who joined the Israelite Society, which is an organization for Israel by Israel. We also have a confirmed Ashkenazi Jew, Jackson Adam Sheftal, working as a deacon in the church. You see, fam, Israel can be found in multiple places associated with First African Baptist Church. For example, members of the church refer to themselves as Gullah slaves. And the word Gullah is a Hebrew word meaning exile. And Gullah slaves also called themselves Binyas, which is also a Hebrew word meaning son of Yah. And these Gullah slaves sang a Hebrew song called Kumbaya, which means arise, come Yah in Hebrew. Shalom, family. It's your brother Benayah Israel. And on this trip to Savannah, Georgia, driving down the long plantation road, I couldn't help but think, we've come a mighty, mighty long way. Yahuwah Zabuot has brought us a mighty long way. From laboring in the hot, sweltering fields of the plantation to driving a minivan down that very road as free people. Hallelujah. He who endures to the end, the same shall be saved. You see, we previously reviewed references showing that the brews were understood to be black. For example, Professor Abraham Melamod stated in his book, The Image of the Black in Jewish Culture, he states that a strong European tradition dating back to the Middle Ages maintained that the brews were black. Or John Mackey in the 1700s states, a tall, thin, very black man, like a Spaniard or a brewer. Or is written in the sources of history when it says that the black Jews of Portugal. We then read references which tracked these brews from Jerusalem to Spain by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon and General Titus of Rome. Then, following a great expulsion in 1492, we then find these brews in various places such as in Africa. Then eventually, by way of the transatlantic slave trade, landing in places such as Brazil, Barbados, and eventually on the coast of Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. Now, King John III is credited for starting the Inquisition in Portugal and using it to expel many of the Christian Jews to Africa and the Americas. This is where the children of Judah's journey to Savannah, Georgia begins. The Inquisition banished large numbers of brews to Brazil. And it reads, in the year 1548, the Jews in Portugal were persecuted by some Catholics called inquisitors, and many of them were consequently banished to Brazil. And the next reference reads, in 1548, the Jews, many of whom had taken refuge in Portugal, were persecuted by the Inquisition and banished to Brazil. Now, it's from Brazil a large group of Spanish and Portuguese Jews would make their way to Savannah, Georgia, by way of Barbados. However, before discussing this group, let's first discuss another group of Spanish and Portuguese Jews who escaped up into England. Now, some brews evaded the Inquisition and found refuge in England. Reads, meanwhile, the Jewish population of London had been continually increasing. Many causes contributed to the influx. Poverty, political troubles, religious persecutions, outbreaks of war, all acted as accessories to the immigration. The quarrels between the emperor and the Turks, the occupation and the recapture of Belgrade caused a temporary inflow towards England from that direction. The renewal of the Inquisition activities in Portugal served to increase the Sephardi, or the Spanish and Portuguese Jew, population of London. All right, so to recap, we're tracking two groups of Spanish and Portuguese brews as they leave Spain and Portugal. One group gets captured by the Inquisition and gets placed in South Central America, mainly Brazil, while another flees from the Inquisition and begins to amass in England. It's during this time that England has colonies in what we would call today the United States. There were two states which offered the brews a place of refuge by a charter of tolerance. In other words, there were two states that would allow the brews to live there without religious persecution. It was the state of Georgia and the state of South Carolina. So in Georgia, there was one city these Spanish and Portuguese brews converged on, the city of Savannah, Georgia. On the day, the 7th of July, 1733, that Oglethorpe had assembled the colonists on the site of the present city of Savannah, for the purpose of allotting to each settler his proportion of land, and of organizing a municipal government. A vessel directly from London came up the Savannah River whilst the colonists were partaking of a public dinner given at the close of the day's proceedings, and landed 40 Jewish immigrants. And the next reference reads, and it reads, in July 1733, 40 Israelites arrived in Savannah. The gentlemen in England who were responsible for sending Jews to Georgia acted from purely charitable motives with the avowed object of accomplishing the result which the London congregation desired to accomplish. Subsequent events too showed that the settlers sent by them were entirely unexceptional. Under the rules of the trustees, nearly all being under 30 years of age, able-bodied and industrious. You see, family, there were so many Spanish and Portuguese brews arriving in Savannah that they made up 1/3 of the total population of Savannah, Georgia. Let me say that again. They made up 1/3 of the total population in Savannah, Georgia. There were so many of them, in fact, they had to rent a house for their assembly. Now, this meeting place was on Market Square in the city of Savannah, and it's important to note that this meeting place of the Spanish and Portuguese brews is on the same street as the First African Baptist Church, and it's roughly 3 to 4 blocks down the street. But let's go ahead and read this reference, and it reads, previous to their departure, articles used in the ceremonial service of the synagogue were presented to them by a friend in London. And one of their first acts after their arrival was to establish a synagogue. Constituting as they did nearly 1/3 of the actual settlers, they had a large congregation, and accordingly, they rented a house on Market Square in Savannah for their synagogue, to which they gave the name Mikveh, or Assemblage of Israel, and where religious services were regularly held for some years. Now, when the Spanish and Portuguese brews lived in Savannah, they lived in an area on the west side of the city, the same neighborhood of the First African Baptist Church. Now, also keep in mind that some brews would leave a few years later during the English and Spanish War, only to return a few years later in large numbers. But this is when they were leaving during that time. It reads, this, however, is followed by another entry which shows that the majority of Jews had left Savannah and they had left to go to Charleston, South Carolina. In July 1741, the journal recites, on the west side of Savannah lies the township lots of the Jews, all gone to the other colonies except for 3 or 4. All right. Now, this is another reference which shows the meeting place, or the location of the meeting place of the Spanish and Portuguese brews. And it reads, it says, at an unknown date, a house was rented on Market, now Ellis Square, and was altered for regular congregational services, but the small congregation faced internal problems. So this reference tells us that the location was on what was called Ellis Square. So some references will just say it's on Market, and some references will say it's on Ellis Square. And here's just another reference from the New Georgia Encyclopedia, just showing us where the meeting place or the assembly location was located. And like the other references, it says the congregation rented a house on Market Square, later Ellis Square. All right, so now we know where these Spanish and Portuguese brews were congregating. If you look at the map on the screen, this is a map of Savannah, Georgia. And what's circled on your screen is the location of the First African Baptist Church. And this is the area, the next area you see on your screen is the area of Market Square, right? Some references will say Market Square extends from Franklin Square all the way down to Ellis Square on your right-hand side. But here, just to be safe, I circled the location of Ellis Square as the location of the meeting place of the Spanish and Portuguese brews. But as you can see, these locations are extremely close to each other. They were in the same neighborhood, right? So basically, the First African Baptist Church and the location of the Spanish and Portuguese brews were in the same neighborhood. And also this highlighted area in green, remember, we read a reference which said that the brews were required, or they lived in a township on the west side of Savannah. So what's highlighted on your screen is the west side of Savannah. So you can see that the First African Baptist Church is squarely within this area that the Spanish and Portuguese Jews lived in. Let's continue reading, family, and it reads, far from being newcomers, Jews are found in smaller or greater numbers in all of the 13 original colonies in the early days of colonial settlement. In some, like New York and Rhode Island, they appear in considerable numbers long before the close of the 17th century. And Yah willing, we'll get to this in another video. But it says in Georgia, they were among the earliest settlers, and it is therefore not unreasonable to expect to find Jewish settlers even in the early days of the Old Dominion. It is a curious fact that though the neighboring colonies of South Carolina and Georgia possessed a fair-sized Jewish community long before the Revolutionary War, Shalom family, it's your brother Benayah Israel, and I would like to invite you to join us in historic Savannah, Georgia, one of the first places inhabited by the Israelites of Spain and Portugal. On June the 27th through the 29th, the African Israelite Justice Foundation will host a conference which will include, but not limited to, historic Savannah tours, a visit to First African Baptist Church, Truth Music Concert, and the conference event. Don't miss this opportunity to learn more about your history and culture and how to survive in the daughter of Babylon. You don't want to miss this historic event, family. So mark your calendars and sign up today. Hope to see you in Savannah, Georgia on June the 27th through the 29th for yet another Israelite gathering. And with that, family, I hope to see you soon, and I bid you Shalom.